which was interesting because I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm sort of known within the Middle East circles as someone who usually can give you useful information, if nothing else. No contact prior to that. And that was an interesting meeting because the gist of that meeting, once we got past sort of the pleasantries, was there was real concern on the Turkish side that the Jewish organizations were abandoning Turkey on the Armenia issue. And this is my reading of what was in that, what we were talking about. And the feeling was that the Jewish right was punishing Turkey for its behavior towards Israel. And so they were looking to the Jewish left to now come in because the Turkish Armenia issue, they thought Armenia genocide, that the whole Jewish community would agree with them, and that any part of the Jewish community that wasn't interested in punishing them could be looked to as an ally. And they were surprised, I think, to find that the American Jewish left has never probably been very comfortable with the American Jewish right's support for not recognizing the Armenian genocide. So that was an interesting meeting. After that, I didn't do much on Turkey again until suddenly we had a flotilla, because still at that point things were on a relative rougher seas, but the ship was still afloat. And I remember the day of the flotilla, which was over a holiday weekend, I got a call from a journalist named Eli Lake, who some of you probably know, who's a friend, and he wanted my organization's comment about Turkey and what was happening with the flotilla. And I said, we don't have anything to say, because and he wrote something about how we didn't want to give he implied that we chose not to comment because we had a reason. And the real reason is we didn't have a policy on Turkey. We never needed a policy on Turkey. This was a relationship that was so strong, and it had nothing to do, I mean, my organization, I engage on Iran, on Egypt, on Syria, on Jordan, on Lebanon. On this issue, it wasn't about geostrategic stuff. We didn't need to weigh in because this was a relationship that was for, a decade or more, almost since the early 90s. This was apart from everything else. It was sort of cordoned off in these safe relationship issues because Turkey and Israel were getting along well. That, of course, now is not the case, and now I do a lot of Turkey. I've been to Turkey 4 times in the past year and a half, which is awesome because I love Istanbul. But there's some interesting things. I was thinking, I actually wrote my notes out, and I'm going to change what I was going to say a little bit. In this book, there's a lot of time given over to sort of finding these moments of when things started to change. Was it the start of the war in Gaza? Was it the flotilla? I'm going to go further back and say there's a really interesting point that is not raised in the book, which I think is key here, which is the Hamas elections in 2006. So if you go back to 2006, you have the Bush administration pushing the democracy agenda in the region. You have an election in Gaza, in the West Bank and Gaza, and Hamas wins, which is really interesting and reverberates across the Arab world and across the Muslim world. And it sets the stage for the siege on Gaza. It sets the stage for the Gaza war. It sets the stage for the flotilla. And it has some of the echoes of the discussions that we're still hearing today in Washington and abroad, which is, is democracy a good thing? This whole framing that we heard for so many years, moderates and extremists. Moderates were defined as people who stuck with us, the U.S., and were generally friendly, or at least not unfriendly to Israel. That was how you defined a moderate. Doesn't work very well in a framing of a region that is experiencing democracy. And we're seeing some of this in Egypt today. So we're in this moment of, I think, just fascinating change. I actually looked back at a speech I gave in Istanbul 6 months ago about the Arab Spring, and I think that this is a really exciting time for Turkey in terms of the potential, and people talk about it in the book. Turkey is very well positioned right now. The whole discussion of can Turkey be a model, which may be exaggerating a little bit, but are there a lot of lessons that Turkey has for the region as it goes through this? I was just in Lebanon. I lived there in the 90s, and I go back pretty often. I've never seen so many Turkish products in Lebanon. It was striking to me. It's the first time I'd been there in 2 years, almost 3 years. So you do see this beginning of some change. On the other hand, I was thinking, some of my friends say when I talk foreign policy or even domestic policy, they say you're like a broken record. Everything comes back to Israel and the Middle East peace process. You start talking about, jobs, and suddenly Lara's talking about the Middle East peace process again, which is probably true. But it's very, and that may be just laziness. We get intellectually lazy and get stuck in our little groove. But in this case, and it comes up in the book over and over, and you can almost feel the authors trying to not get back into this Middle East peace process groove, but it does feel a little bit inevitable. When I look back on my understanding of the Israeli-Turkish relationship, and I first went to Turkey when I was living in Israel. I was posted there as a foreign service officer, and I went with some Israeli Arab friends to Turkey in 1994. None of us spoke Turkish, but it didn't matter because there were signs everywhere in Hebrew. I mean, it was great. I mean, and it was striking to me how many Israelis were around, how friendly the place was to Israeli tourism, really how strong that relationship was. But even then, I mean, it always seemed that it was more of a bargain, a tactical decision on both sides. A decision by the Turkish military that this relationship is valuable economically, it's valuable in terms of getting weapons we can't get otherwise, it's valuable in terms of politics vis-a-vis the Kurds, it's valuable in terms of domestic politics vis-a-vis Islamists. So you have the bargain on that side. On the Israeli side, it's valuable in terms of what Israel wants desperately, which is a sense of being welcome in the region, of being kosher in the region, having their allies on the periphery, since you can't have the allies on the interior. And the Middle East peace process is a big part of that. It's not a coincidence that going there in 1994, shortly after Oslo, things were booming. It is not a coincidence, and this comes up over and over in the book. As the peace process, I don't want to say cover, but as the peace process sort of falls apart, and this goes back to the 2006 Hamas election, I actually think it's a really important framing. Once that cover for this bargain evaporates, it's much, much harder. And it's not only easier for a political party that wants to be more populist to appeal to their population in terms of being anti-Israel, which is certainly, a good populist argument in many countries. But when you lose the cover of, there's even a semblance of a peace process. I work on these issues every day. I try to imagine if there had been a rapprochement between Israel and Turkey following the Palmer report, what would have happened to that rapprochement when immediately after the UN meeting, the Bibi speech, which was not the most pro-peace speech in history, immediately after that we've had massive announcements of massive settlement expansion in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem. How does that rapprochement continue? And there's not really any cushion because there isn't really a peace process to give it cover, and there's no sense that there is, even in the longer term, a political horizon where the occupation ends, where the Gaza issue is not just a painful wound that people across the region and the Muslim world feel strongly about. So I think I'm getting sort of yes. Okay, so I'm gonna wind it up there. I was going to talk a little bit about winners and losers in the Arab Spring, but we can talk about that in Q&A. Thank you.
Gönül.
Thank you, Ellen. I think this is a very important book because whenever we talk about the triangular relationship between the United States, Turkey, and Israel, the debate is always focused on either Turkish government's Islamist ideology or the strength of the Israeli lobby in Washington or the pro-Israel sentiment in the United States. And I think the articles in this book reject those simplistic arguments, and they take into account other factors such as public opinion, domestic, regional, and international power structure, elite preferences, and the country's ideological positioning. And it prompts us to look at the interaction of domestic, regional, and international forces. So in that sense, I really, really enjoyed the book.